On March 26, 1827, Ludwig van Beethoven lay dying in his bed in Vienna. Outside, a violent thunderstorm raged across the city. As lightning illuminated his room, the 56-year-old composer raised his fist toward the heavens in one final act of defiance against the fate that had tormented him for decades. Then he collapsed and died. The man who had created some of the most beautiful music ever written had spent the last 15 years of his life in complete silence. Beethoven composed his greatest masterpieces, the Ninth Symphony, the late string quartets, the Missa Solemnis, without being able to hear a single note. This is the story of the composer who conquered deafness and how silence became his greatest teacher. What would you sacrifice to create something eternal if you knew you'd never experience it yourself? Ludwig van Beethoven was born in Bonn, Germany, on December 17, 1770. His father, Johann, was a court musician with a drinking problem and violent temper. His mother, Maria, was a gentlewoman who tried to shield her children from their father's rage. From the moment Ludwig could walk, Johann saw dollar signs in his son's musical talent. Johann had heard the stories of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the child prodigy who had made his family rich by performing across Europe. He was determined that Ludwig would be his ticket to wealth and fame. The training was brutal. Johann would wake 4-year-old Ludwig in the middle of the night and force him to practice piano until dawn. If the boy made a mistake, Johann would beat him. If he cried, Johann would beat him harder. "You will be the next Mozart," Johann would scream, "or you will be nothing." But Ludwig was not Mozart. He was something else entirely. Where Mozart was elegant and refined, Ludwig was raw and powerful. Where Mozart's music flowed like silk, Ludwig's music erupted like a volcano. By age 8, Ludwig was performing publicly in Bonn. But unlike Mozart, who charmed audiences with his grace and wit, Ludwig was awkward and intense. He played with such passion that he would sweat through his clothes and sometimes break piano strings. People didn't know what to make of this strange, wild child who played music like his life depended on it. In 1787, when Ludwig was 16, he traveled to Vienna to study with Mozart himself. The meeting was brief but memorable. Mozart listened to Ludwig play and was impressed by his technical skill. But when he asked the young man to improvise, something magical happened. Ludwig closed his eyes and began to play. The music that poured from his fingers was unlike anything Mozart had ever heard. It was dark, complex, and emotionally devastating. When Ludwig finished, Mozart turned to his friends and said, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." But Ludwig's time in Vienna was cut short when his mother became seriously ill. He rushed back to Bonn, arriving just in time to watch her die of tuberculosis. Maria Beethoven's death shattered Ludwig. She had been his protector, his source of love in a household dominated by his father's cruelty. Without her, Ludwig felt utterly alone. At 17, Ludwig became the head of his household. His father had descended into alcoholism and was no longer capable of supporting the family. Ludwig had to care for his 2 younger brothers while trying to build his own musical career. The responsibility was crushing, but it also forged Ludwig's character. He learned that he could depend on no one but himself. He learned that life was a battle that had to be fought every single day. In 1792, Ludwig moved permanently to Vienna, the musical capital of Europe. He was 22 years old, ambitious, and determined to make his mark on the world. Vienna in the 1790s was a city of aristocrats and artists, where wealthy patrons competed to sponsor the most talented musicians. Ludwig quickly found supporters who were impressed by his virtuosic piano playing and his bold, original compositions. But Ludwig was different from other court musicians. He refused to wear the livery of a servant. He demanded to be treated as an equal by his aristocratic patrons. He would not bow or scrape for anyone. "There are thousands of princes," he once told a nobleman, "but there is only one Beethoven." This arrogance should have destroyed his career. Instead, it made him famous. Viennese society was fascinated by this wild genius who dared to treat dukes and counts like ordinary men. Ludwig's early compositions, his first two symphonies, his piano sonatas, his string quartets, established him as the most exciting composer of his generation. His music was more dramatic, more emotionally intense than anything that had come before. But just as Ludwig's career was reaching its peak, disaster struck. In 1798, at age 28, Ludwig began to notice that his hearing was deteriorating. At first, it was subtle. He had trouble following conversations in noisy rooms, or he would miss soft passages when other musicians were playing. Ludwig was terrified. For a musician, deafness was a death sentence. How could he compose if he couldn't hear? How could he perform if he couldn't hear the applause? He consulted doctor after doctor, trying every treatment available. He poured cold water in his ears. He took herbal remedies. He even tried electrical therapy, allowing doctors to run electric currents through his head. Nothing worked. By 1802, Ludwig's hearing had deteriorated so badly that he could barely function in social situations. He became increasingly isolated, avoiding public appearances and spending long hours alone in his apartment. In October 1702, Ludwig wrote a letter that he never intended to send. Known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, it was addressed to his brothers, but was really a suicide note. "O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me," he wrote. "You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you." Ludwig was contemplating ending his life. The pain of losing his hearing, combined with his natural tendency toward depression, had brought him to the brink of despair. But then something extraordinary happened. "It was impossible for me to leave the world before I had brought forth all that I felt called upon to bring forth," he continued in the letter. Ludwig realized that his music was bigger than his personal suffering. He had a mission to complete, a gift to give to humanity. His deafness would not stop him. From that moment on, Ludwig's music changed. It became deeper, more profound, more emotionally complex. It was as if losing his hearing had freed him to explore new realms of musical expression. His third symphony, the Eroica, premiered in 1804 and shocked the musical world. It was longer, more dramatic, and more structurally complex than any symphony that had come before. It announced that Ludwig van Beethoven was no longer just another composer. He was a revolutionary. The Eroica was followed by a series of masterpieces that redefined what music could be. The Fifth Symphony, with its famous Fate Knocking at the Door opening. The Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, which painted musical pictures of the countryside. The Emperor Concerto, which pushed the piano to its limits. But Ludwig's greatest challenge was yet to come. By 1814, Ludwig was completely deaf. He could no longer hear his own piano playing. He could no longer conduct orchestras. He communicated with friends and colleagues through written conversation books. Most composers would have given up. Ludwig composed some of his greatest works. The Ninth Symphony, completed in 1824, was Ludwig's musical testament. It was a celebration of human brotherhood, featuring a full chorus singing Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy. The message was clear. Despite all the suffering in the world, joy and love would ultimately triumph. Ludwig never heard the Ninth Symphony performed. At the premiere, he stood on stage with his back to the audience, trying to conduct an orchestra he couldn't hear. When the performance ended, the audience erupted in applause. But Ludwig didn't know until one of the soloists turned him around to see the standing ovation. The sight of the cheering crowd moved Ludwig to tears. He had created something beautiful, something that brought joy to others, even though he could never experience it himself. Ludwig's late string quartets, composed in his final years, are considered by many to be the greatest chamber music ever written. They are intensely personal works, musical conversations between a man and his own soul. These pieces were so advanced, so emotionally complex, that many of Ludwig's contemporaries couldn't understand them. Music for the future, one critic called them. They were right. Ludwig's late works wouldn't be fully appreciated until the 20th century, when musicians and audiences finally caught up to his vision. Ludwig's personal life was marked by loneliness and unfulfilled love. He never married, though he fell in love several times with women who were either already married or from social classes that made marriage impossible. His most famous love affair was with a woman known only as the immortal beloved, to whom he wrote passionate letters that were discovered after his death. The identity of this woman remains one of music history's greatest mysteries. Ludwig's relationship with his nephew Karl was perhaps the most important of his later years. When Karl's father died, Ludwig fought a bitter legal battle to become the boy's guardian. He poured all his frustrated paternal instincts into caring for Karl, but his overprotectiveness and emotional intensity proved overwhelming for the young man. In 1826, Karl attempted suicide, leaving a note that blamed his uncle's oppressive behavior. The incident devastated Ludwig and may have contributed to his final illness. Ludwig's health had been declining for years. He suffered from liver disease, probably caused by his heavy drinking. He had chronic stomach problems and frequent bouts of depression. In December 1826, Ludwig caught pneumonia after a difficult journey to visit Karl. His condition worsened rapidly, and by March 1827, it was clear that he was dying. On March 26, 1827, as a thunderstorm raged outside his window, Ludwig van Beethoven died. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "I shall hear in heaven." Ludwig's funeral was attended by over 20,000 people. The entire city of Vienna seemed to mourn the loss of their greatest composer. But Ludwig's true legacy wasn't in the crowds that mourned him. It was in the music he left behind. Beethoven's 9 symphonies redefined what orchestral music could be. His 32 piano sonatas pushed the instrument to its limits and beyond. His string quartets explored the deepest emotions of the human heart. But more than that, Ludwig changed how we think about music itself. Before Beethoven, music was primarily entertainment for the wealthy. Ludwig made it a vehicle for expressing the full range of human experience: joy, sorrow, triumph, despair, love, loss. He showed that music could be philosophical, that it could grapple with the biggest questions of existence. His Ninth Symphony's message of universal brotherhood inspired everyone from freedom fighters to civil rights leaders. Ludwig's struggle with deafness also changed how we think about disability. He proved that physical limitations don't have to limit human achievement. His greatest works were created not despite his deafness, but because of how he responded to it. When Ludwig could no longer hear external sounds, he learned to hear the music inside his head with perfect clarity. His deafness forced him to rely entirely on his inner musical vision, and that vision was more powerful than anything he could have heard with his ears. Today, Ludwig van Beethoven is recognized as one of the greatest artists who ever lived. His music is performed thousands of times every day around the world. His Ninth Symphony has become an anthem for human dignity and freedom. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Ludwig's legacy is how personal it feels to each listener. His music speaks directly to the human soul, expressing emotions that we all feel but struggle to put into words. When you listen to the opening of the Fifth Symphony, you hear fate knocking at the door of your own life. When you hear the Ode to Joy, you feel the possibility of human brotherhood. When you listen to his late string quartets, you hear a man wrestling with the deepest questions of existence. Ludwig van Beethoven created music's greatest masterpieces without being able to hear them, but But in doing so, he created something even more remarkable. He gave us a way to hear ourselves. His deafness was his greatest tragedy, but it was also his greatest gift to humanity. The man who lost his hearing taught the world how to listen. The composer who lived in silence filled the world with sound. And the artist who never heard his greatest works created music that will be heard forever. Ludwig van Beethoven proved that the human spirit is stronger than any obstacle, that creativity can triumph over any limitation, and that true art comes not from what we can hear with our ears, but from what we can hear with our hearts. He created music's greatest masterpieces without hearing them. But we can hear them still. And in hearing them, we hear something of the divine spark that burns within us all. The music of Ludwig van Beethoven is the sound of the human soul refusing to be silenced. It is the sound of triumph over tragedy. It is the sound of immortality.